Well, Enola, congratulations on 30 years in local radio. What an achievement. How did you get started in local radio?
Well, it has been nothing but fun and a lot of work, yes, and some, things I might rather have done differently. But overall, Jimmy, and I think you might say the same thing, it's been a lot of fun, and it still is because I'm just making the mark of 30 years. I intend to go forward from here. I got started right after we moved to town. In 1986 at Fall Festival, my husband and myself and my children went to Fall Festival, and we were coming along and we see a radio station booth set up, and so I expressed some interest in it, and the man there said that they were looking to hire people. So in the next year I did apply. I had a new baby, but I was ready to look for a part-time job. So working at a radio station sounded interesting, and I didn't know that it would really change my life. I was just looking for a part-time job. But I did get hired to do sales and production for KDXE, and it was out near the hospital on Glover Street. It was not a very old station. And I sold from a desk, but I sold by phone from a desk which was about the size of a school desk, and it was in where the transmitter was. And all there was just a corridor and the transmitter. I think there was a back door. But occasionally someone would come in and take a transmitter reading, which we still have to do today, and say hello and go out. And I was just on the phone with merchants and clients. So I developed a personal style of calling and talking, and I made sales. They bought my advertising packages, and I made my sales quota every month. And the prize for the sales quota was a dinner for two at K-Bob's, who was one of our
All right.
one of our advertisers. So what I would do would be make my sales quota and save my dinners up for each quarter, and so I could take my whole family out. And most of my listeners will know I have 5 children, so we had a big family. But the fun part of the job to me was, and still is, writing and recording commercials. I love doing production for the clients, the advertisers. So back then, when I first started, the recording booth had a reel-to-reel machine. So you would take your own reel that you'd been assigned and load it on the machine and record your script for a sale or an open house or whatever it was you were advertising. But if you made a mistake in the recording, then you had to cut the mistake out. You'd continue talking and you'd correct yourself, but when you were done, you'd have to cut out those parts and cut it with a special little knife and splice it with a special little adhesive tape. Well, you could produce a perfect recording the first time, but rarely, so you'd have errors. But you could achieve a meticulous sound and not have that little sound when it came to the cut part.
Right.
That was the goal, to make it clear and clean. But with digital recording today, it's just as easy as the click of a mouse, to get a pristine recording. But it's still challenging, and it's still fun and satisfying. Among my co-workers at Dixie at that time were Mark Chapman, who went to KETR, and Frida Ross, who went to WBAP, and she is still there today.
And you left there to come to KSST. Why?
I did. Well,
And how?
I was working at Dixie, and the general manager from KPUS in Paris came to visit, and he met me, and then he recruited me, offered me a pay raise. So I thought that I would be advancing, you see. So I said I would, and I went over there and did direct sales. There was a little station on the Loop out there in Paris, and I was learning direct sales, which I did learn a lot. But there was no commercial production for me and no on-air shift, as had been hinted at. And so I was getting a little disillusioned about that. Plus the half-hour commute twice a day, and I had small children at home, so it really wasn't working for me. So I came back to Sulphur Springs and decided I would put in an application at the old radio station in town. And as I came to realize, it was old because it was good. And it had lasted a long, long time, and still is. But anyway, I put my application in and was called to come in for an interview, and I interviewed with program director Dwayne Grimes. And we talked a bit, and then he sent me in to Bill Bradford for a sound check. And so I got hired and actually started the next day. Excuse me. But later I had to realize that after I met Brad and found out that he was a pilot, World War II, and afterward, probably he just hired me for my name, Enola Gay. But anyway, he taught me some stuff and
Right.
really helped me with a career. So I began then learning to manage Mother, which is this room-sized computer behind us here, Jimmy. That
Yes.
You remember?
I
so
do
well.
remember Mother.
I never was sure why she was called Mother, but she was. So, other staffers that were on at that time were Peavine Pinion, Ken Bell, Jim Thompson, Claude Walter, also Cecil Savage. Doug Hasted came to work a year after I did, but he was hired specifically for TV because Channel 18 was starting in 1990. And Dolly Kelly, she came to work about the same time, and she still works at KSST today. Don Julian came as news and sports director later, I think in 2007.
6.
Okay. And I don't remember when you came on.
96.
Okay. That was a time in the years when we all knew each other, not just here, of course, but in town, and shared awareness of the world using the same information. We had radio, local radio, and we had local newspaper. Then we had our TV station. But the world was a much smaller place, maybe a bit more agreeable back then. I want to tell you more about this Mother monster computer here. She had a mind of her own, and she would frequently just go down and we'd be off the air, so we'd have to revert to live. So we would just play records and talk on the microphone until someone could straighten her out. Sometimes we'd have to make a call for somebody to come down here and straighten her out. So you'd have to be prepared to work through that. We always had a record on the turntable just in case. Lightning strikes also seemed to plague us a lot back then. Frequently the station would have to get back on the air with the help of the gasoline-powered generator that was in the little building out back. And that was old school emergency backup power. Well, not just here but everywhere. In places where natural disaster has struck, radio stations have stayed on the air, supplying important information with the use of sometimes siphoned gasoline from wrecked or abandoned cars,
Right.
whatever it took. But after computers came to be more sophisticated and went digital, they were incompatible with the electrical current that generators supplied.
Right.
And so that had to be discontinued, but that was another change in local radio.
Yeah. You began on-air shifts with KSST. Was that your first on-air shift or first major on-air shift?
It was my first on-air shift.
Yeah. What hour of the day did you start?
Well, I came on about 9. I didn't have the early, I didn't have the other early, because we started at 4:30 a.m. So I came on at 9 and worked till about noon, and then I got another one, which was an afternoon, so I was working a full day. And then after a bit, the early morning, one of the early morning people here was going to leave, and that shift came open, 4:30 a.m. So I applied for it, or let them know that I wanted it, and so I did get that shift and began to work it. So I kind of discontinued the later afternoon one, but I was the first female to be able to have that responsibility. And I also assisted with Wildcat football some on Friday nights, so that when you were up late with a game that was out of town, and then you're back in at 4:30 Saturday morning, you just sort of have to pace yourself through the weeks of football season. But it was very exciting to be in the center of things that KSST was and is.
Yeah, I can understand that.
And you know, Jimmy, it's not unusual to hear odd things in this building at night, or when you have to come out for the weather or whatever. But I could hear odd things once in a while, but I saw something odd over a period of a couple of years. I saw an image in white up close, and I didn't know what that was. First time was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I was here doing a weather report, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw an image in white, someone rushing in towards Bradford's office. And so I just thought it was him coming in to do cover the thunderstorm, but I never did hear anything from him, so I went out to look, and his door had never been opened, and the front door was still locked. Well, I just sort of, didn't think about it too much. But another day, it was in the noon hour, and I was recording a trading post in the back recording booth, and someone came in all white, silently, and just sort of slipped in behind me and reached for something over there and then slipped back out. Again, I'm talking on the microphone and I don't want to stop, so I just moved my eyes and I couldn't see who it was. So later I went out front and nobody was wearing all white that day. We had a big staff then, and there were plenty of people in the building. So Grimes, he suggested it might have been Dawn. Well, I don't mean Don Julian. I didn't know who Don was. Don Scripture, legendary host, I should say late Don Scripture, legendary host of the 1230 Club, he'd passed away about a decade before that. And so I still have questions about that. But truly, as part of our history here, Don was the announcer who got the biggest surprise of his life when he came in that morning and found KSST had been stolen. Everything in the building was stolen, from the phones to the transmitter to everything that had a wire on it. And the thieves, though, their plan was foiled because their loaded truck and trailer had bogged down behind the station, and they fled the scene on foot in the dark. But law enforcement was able to apprehend these thieves because they had boarded a Greyhound bus heading west. And Bradford was able to get the station back on the air, at least in a partial sense, by noon that day. But that did make history.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it made history with Brad, too.
There was another historic moment, and this didn't happen to me, and it was before I came on, but this is shared history that we have. Announcer Dick Caldwell, who was KSST's voice of the Wildcats, he was working the noon hour on November 22nd, 1963, when the AP machine began to go off in the front room. Now, we had the Associated Press machine, and it would print stuff all the time. It may or may not pertain to us, but you'd check it. When it printed something important, it made a little more noise. So he was in the control room, but he heard the machine going off, so he went out and looked, and it's printing out a thing saying, "Urgent bulletin for immediate broadcast. The president has been shot," and listing just the details that we needed at the time. Well, Bradford was in Dallas awaiting Kennedy at the press conference. So I can only imagine Dick's, I guess he maybe a momentary pause or doubt. He had nobody to run this by, but he headed to the microphone and did the job he'd been trained to do.
Right.
I had a historic moment at 9/11. I was on the board that morning, the board shifted, when ABC, which was our network, ABC took over the airwaves on all ABC stations, including KSST, at about 8:50 that morning. Well, suddenly we were in the grip of a national emergency. Bradford ran out of his office to stare at the television. We were all staring at the television and watching those towers. And I guess it was his first time maybe to experience this too, but we all were watching and listening, and it saved a memory of what we did right then at 9/11. But later that day, local programming was resumed, but it was an humbling experience and reassuring, though, looking back at it now, to watch the process and to be able to trust the news and reports that we were getting, the reporters who shared it so professionally through radio and TV and newspaper.
Yeah. You know, we look back at the past and how we did things and the things that we did, and the interesting thing is radio has changed over its history. What are some of the changes that you've seen?
Well, it has to change, as everything does. Radio is still a very viable business, and I'm pleased to still be part of it. But over the past few years, the diversity of radio for Sulphur Springs has changed. Let's say 1947, KSST began. Some years later, KDXE came in with an FM license. It's now Star Country, but it was the only FM for a long time. There's been a couple of others, but back in the 1970s, the FCC mandated diversity, and so in licensing new stations. So when the when KSST, the only radio station locally at the time, applied for an FM license to broaden their reach, the license approval went to another applicant. What surprise it was to turn out that a KSST employee who was assisting in filling out the paperwork and the application process for Bradford also filled out a set for himself. And that's how KDXE came to be. So I guess it's fitting then that after all these years, KSST now has an FM license and is operating a new station from within the building as of late this year.
Yeah. That's with a license management agreement at this point, waiting for the final part of the sale to come about. When you look at 30 years in radio, what do you see as the high point of those 30 years for you? What's the biggest thing that happened for you?
Well, I can't say it was any event, because each day is like some stitches in a fabric, and it all comes out to be a big picture at the end. But the most impact on me and the most lasting has got to be the listeners, getting to know those people. And I want to say some things about that too. And the world was smaller then. I know I've said that before, but we were closer. We had fewer distractions. When someone told you something, then you pretty much could take it, and we didn't have a lot of different types of reports coming at us.
Right.
I like knowing the history of KSST. There was a lady who told me, this is a kind of an insight on some things that listeners share. She said she was in labor with her daughter the day that KSST went on the air. And in the hospital where she was, which I know wasn't our hospital that's now where the library is, but one of the small hospitals, she heard that radio station's first broadcasts while she was there that day. So it made such an impact on them. Her daughter grew up and became a minister out in California, but on her 50th birthday, she came home to celebrate that with her mother here at the radio station, who was also turning 50 that day.
Wow.
Also, dairies in the county, they played the radio station, and the cows liked KSST. Well, they liked the regularity, I think,
Right.
of the broadcast. A native of Sulphur Springs once told me that if you walked to town on a nice day, you could hear KSST all the way to town, because every house you passed had the broadcast going.
Right.
So you wouldn't miss the Trading Post or the news at all. And a lot of parents of high schoolers, they could listen to the Wildcat football games in case they couldn't go. And a lot of times folks couldn't go as often as they can now. High schoolers actually operated the station from Radio Workshop. And in fact, the grandson of Soul, you may not know that you know him, Pastor H.B. Nash was a radio workshopper.
Right.
And he had that little handle there. And I think he's back helping us out here sometimes. During bad weather, National Weather Service and local radar were vital for the safety of the people who live in this area. School bus transportation, KSST was the main source of information for them about the locale of the storm.
Mm-hmm.
There was a couple that I met, they came to meet me. There was the huge, devastating ice storm in the 1990s. And I think over in Mineola, they didn't have power for a couple of weeks.
Right.
It just wrecked the lines. But this couple lived, I think, in Precinct 4 here. And their road out from their home was trees down, and it was iced up. And they had a fireplace, and they didn't have electrical power or phone, but they had their pickup. And they could go in the pickup and run the motor and listen to the radio a little bit and stay warm with the fireplace. And they did this for about 3 days. So when they were able to get to town, they came by KSST to thank me because I had kept them company and made them feel like, that time was going to finally come to an end. it's companionship and entertainment and caring concern that I feel the best connection with the people that listen.
Yeah, yeah. We've made so many friends in the community until sometimes they feel like we're family. The connection that we make with those people, they recognize our voice. They may have never seen us, but they recognize our voice and they stop us on the street. That has to be, that has, after 30 years especially, that has to be something that really causes you to think about the legacy you've created with radio.
Well, as I say often, many others were doing this before I came here and already had set the tone for what KSST serves. But it's been my privilege to get to do that. I wanted to mention the politicians, too, kind of get a benefit from local service such as this. Now, national news, of course, we all hear it, but from the local old school communication, from, let's say, a city or county candidate, all the way to a state representative, if they were wise, they used local media such as radio in little towns in their district to their advantage. They'd find a capable, trusted newsman who, with an intelligent interview, could give that candidate a fair amount of time to acquaint the constituents with his stand on the issues before they would ever go to vote. And that approach is personal, and it still works.
Mm-hmm. You're exactly right, and that's what local radio is, isn't it? It's just that personal touch of being community.
Well, I think it's something like the Old Farmer's Almanac slogan, useful with a pleasant degree of humor. But I do want to say, Jimmy, that I feel close to the people that I have helped serve just through the daily process, getting up in the morning and getting your day started, and radio being so much a part of that. I have been invited to eat Thanksgiving and Christmas supper with families. I've had gifts, homemade items, cards, all kinds of things. One lady whose husband passed away at home that day, she called me second after having called a funeral home. She wanted to tell me. Another woman here in town named her granddaughter Enola after me. I've had a portrait of me drawn by a prisoner in the county jail. Well, he was in there for a number of months, but he had to listen to KSST every day because the sheriff's wife cooked and brought their meals, and that's what she listened to. Anyway, he used a newspaper photograph of me and drew this picture I still have. All kinds of other opportunities came my way. They're small but memorable, like I got to ride the elephant at the circus and a llama at a remote we did, and I was going to do a tandem parachute jump with my boss, but it got scratched at the last. That would have been something to remember.
No kidding.
But anyway, the best of all of it has been the one-on-one contact with KSST listeners. And that's what I plan to keep on doing, because this 30 years is just a mark, and I wanted to mark it by talking about these things today.
Right.
And I want to get everyone who's listening to and viewing to tune in for the morning show, 6 to 9 a.m. here on KSST. And the 12:30 West show, which is Saturday mornings at 7 and Thursday nights at 7. And please come to the Riley Springs Jamboree, too, because that's on third Saturdays of every month. And I'm loving it, and I'm going for 31 in 2018.
I was going to say, you're in the 31st year, and you're probably planning on another 30 years or so with this?
Well, we'll see.
That'll work. Thank you. That's good.